Now that I've come out of hiding, my fears are forgetting to be afraid. Now that I've dropped my opinions in the rain, my story is too small to cover my heart. Now that I've put down what I thought was important, I'm surprised by angels lost along the way. How we got here doesn't matter, and where we're going is just something for the mind to chew. I'll meet you here, in the palace that difficulty opens, the magical doorway, the shape of who we are. That was Where to Now by Mark Nepo. Beautiful writer, poet, teacher, facilitator, and a brilliant piece to open and frame the conversation with another beautiful writer, facilitator, and I suppose a distant but a digital mentor of a type that I've admired and learnt so much from over the last 5 years or so when I first came upon her work. And her name is Heather Plett. She's a very gifted facilitator, deep thinker, feeler in the space of holding space for ourselves and holding space for others. And she's the founder of the Center for Holding Space, who runs a brilliant and very well-designed practitioner program, teaching the art of something that, as most arts, maybe that's why it's called an art, it sometimes feels hard to teach, but the art of holding space. And so I very much look forward to having this conversation with Heather after reading many of her blog posts and being kind of blown away and also really affirmed in the way that she articulates the art of holding space. And so we touch on themes like, can you teach someone how to hold space? What are the dimensions of holding space, both personally, both socially, emotionally, transpersonally, the spiritual dimension? We talk a lot about mystery and calling on the mystery and having a relationship to the mystery, and however it is that you relate to that, how having that relationship enables you the capacity to hold space for wholeness. We talk about her notion of being the bowl and not the mould, and the 3 layers to the bowl, and pull them apart in great depth. We also talk about the opposite of holding space. If holding space is to liberate, then the opposite of holding space might be to hijack, and how that shows up in our world in quite a patriarchally patterned environment, what it means to liberate and to be the bowl. The role of meta-cognition in holding the whole and holding space for wholeness, and for, I know, we both relate and share a deep love for journaling and self-reflective practice. And so the role of self-reflective and contemplative practice in deepening our metacognition, or our metacognitive ability to hold space for wholeness and to kind of broaden our ontologies or our ideas of what is, so that we can hold more of others and ourselves in that space. We also talk about the shift from self-care to community care, and therefore from self-reflection to community reflection, so that we are reflecting in social spaces and being held accountable to our blind spots. And again, broadening our conception of what is, of who is, and increasing our ability to hold the whole. So there's much, much more in there around circles of trust and protecting courage, the role of grief work in bearing our emotions and being able to sit in presence with the primal scream and what that is. And so there is much, much, much more in here, all very much around the notion of holding space for wholeness within ourselves and others, and what are the dimensions to that in a very practical and also a very philosophical sense. And so with that, I will let you dive in, enjoy, relish it. You might want to press pause or rewind a little bit a number of times on this one, because there are definitely snippets of gold. And do check out the links in the show notes. There are some great resources. Obviously, Heather's book, The Center for Holding Space itself. So do check out the show notes, and I look forward to hearing your reflections. It would be brilliant if you do feel to share with those who also have an interest in holding space on the other side. Lots of love. Grab a tea, take a breath. Notice the inhale, the exhale, and the space between. A moment in between moments. Here you are. You're listening to Spaces Between with your friend and host, Al Jeffrey. An open exploration into restoring connection in the 21st century, in our personal lives, our relationships, and our communities. What does it mean to live in relationship to the wholeness of who we are together? My guess is that you're somewhat like me, and that you feel the impact of a great disconnect in a very real, a very personal, and a very collective way. And they also feel the call, the invitation to participate in what Joanna Macy calls the great turning, to restore relationship, wholeness, and connection, and to support the regeneration of consciousness and culture, all in service to weaving the Charles Eisenstein calls the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. I'm also going to guess that you're already doing this work in your very own way, so thank you. And Spaces Between is really a platform and a community building tool for an open inquiry into these questions to support you, to support me, and to support us in this very remembering of who we are together. Maybe how can we queer our minds? How can we de-domesticate, rewild our minds, and restore a relational way of being with ourselves and with each other? And to renew a culture that tends to the whole from the inside out. That's what we're here for, my friends. Now, I'm not one for ads and am one, though, for creating something beautiful with others, in this case, you. So I do invite you to be part of the magic. If you enjoy our time together, if you gain nourishment from these conversations, and make sure to subscribe Spotify and Apple Podcasts and rate the show and even leave a review. Leaving a rating or written review on Apple Podcasts really helps those who stumble across the show to choose to lean in and try an episode and drink from these waters. It also really helps enroll the next juicy guest that we're going to have on the show. So do go ahead and leave a written review, and definitely rate on Apple Podcasts if you can. And if you're feeling super generous and fueled and filled up by our conversations, you might even consider donating or soon joining my community membership. You can head over to www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com for all of that, all of the show notes, and lots more. For now, this is it. Let's dive in. Heather, thank you so much for joining for a conversation. It's such a pleasure to be in the Zoom grid with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure on my side as well.
Yeah, it's I've admired and been inspired by and supported by much of your content online for, I suppose, the last 4 years at least. And so it's brilliant to be in live dialogue and to be able to follow some of the threads that I'd say are very much still alive in me through my reading of your work.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, thank you for all you offer and the opportunity to dive into dialogue.
Yes, you're very welcome. I'm looking forward to the conversation. As I said to you just before we started recording, I see that you have a depth of analysis and curiosity about this. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. And as I shared as well before we click record, I suppose my hope for this conversation is many listeners are either adept facilitators already or simply attempting or aspiring to contribute to the more beautiful world, as Charles Eisenstein would say, inside and out. So to really be stewards of cultures of wholeness. And so I really hope that our conversation can add some tools, some perspectives, some philosophy, some affirmation to their toolbox, as I'm sure it will. Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. And how would you feel about just doing a little check-in quickly before we dive in, just to really arrive together in the conversation?
Sure. Yeah.
And for those listening in, obviously. Yeah. For those listening in, also just an opportunity. This may be the first time you have today or this evening, whenever you're tuning in, just to take space to turn the attention inwards and to really arrive. And so maybe we'll just check in with how we're feeling physically and emotionally and just share that into the space together, if that feels all right. So we can just kick off. It's the beauty about audio. We can just splice it as we like. Yeah, we can just kick off. If you would be open to sharing first, just, a quick physical, emotional check-in.
So I would say I'm arriving feeling relaxed. I just finished a really nourishing conversation with a couple of friends. And after this call, I'm going to sit down to a meal with my 3 daughters. And so I'm sort of sandwiched by 2 relational spaces and believe this will be a relational space as well. So that's how I'm arriving, just really enjoying the juiciness of being in conversation and relational spaces with people.
Thank you for sharing. I'm checking in. Yeah, feeling definitely the new day. It's a very autumnal morning here. The frost was lifting as I went for my morning walk. The sun is out. Yeah, we have this patch of a couple of really warm days here in Melbourne, which we haven't seen for a couple of weeks. So feeling just that support the lifting of my spirits and bring me into this conversation, which I've been very much looking forward to. So I'm feeling light and I'd say open, very curious as to where our time together will take us.
Yes.
That's me checking in.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose to build context for the conversation and I suppose situate the conversation in a space. How is it that how is it that you describe the time that we're in, whether that be collectively or for yourself and just in a very personal way? How is it that you, I suppose, sense and feel this time that we're all sitting in and living through?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the terms that I use a lot in my work when I was exploring the concept of holding space, I kept looking for a term about what it is we're holding. And the term that's become really important for me is the term liminal space. And liminal space is kind of the space in between an old reality and a new reality. And there's that, I often talk about the caterpillar evolving through the chrysalis stage into butterfly. And really, I sense that we are globally in a liminal space, that this pandemic has thrust us into an unknown, unfamiliar, unrecognizable space where the old order, the way we were in relationship, the way we were in community and country, et cetera, is just not going to be the way we will be when we come out of this pandemic. And so it's a really sensing into how is this changing us? How is it transforming us globally? And what do we need to do to sit with the discomfort of that and be present for it so that we can be present for the emergence when we come out the other side, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, I love the idea of, and I love that we've got dove into the terrain of liminality straight away and the spaces between, which is obviously something I resonate with very deeply, the space between what was and what's not yet. And the absolute discomfort and mess in that space. And I suppose acknowledging my position of privilege as well, but also acknowledging that in some ways, this is our nature, in my perspective, the liminality, the ever-changing flow. And it's been for many, and unfortunately those who do exist in minority groups and those who are systemically oppressed, very painful and challenging time.
Absolutely.
And for many of us as well, a also very challenging crash course in what it means to live with impermanence and change and maybe the natural liminality of all things.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. There is a commonality to the experience and there is disparity to the experience too. And we have to hold the complexity of that. We have to hold the recognition that we do hold privilege within even in disruption, there is privilege and complexity and we don't all face it the same and we're not all going to emerge the same. And some of us will be absolutely devastated by it. Our lifestyles are, a disruption. And we used to work in nonprofit and spent a number of years traveling to places like Africa and India and Bangladesh, some of the poorest parts of the world. And it was so clear that we were really wrestling at that time it was a food related agency that I work with. And we were really wrestling with how much more something like hunger and climate change, for example, was disrupting the most marginalized and the poor in that situation. And so even though all of us all over the world are feeling the effects of climate change, it's much more on the shoulders of those that are dealing with the poverty. So, and I think I would say the same thing in a pandemic as well. It's always going to be a greater burden for those who are marginalized.
Yeah. And yes, I suppose that's incredibly important to have that as the kind of environment in which this conversation is taking place and to maybe start to touch on why. I suppose the couple of things I want to touch on. One is why the topic or the conversation of holding space now. Why does it feel like an alive thread to be pulling for us? And also, and maybe after that first question, what is it? It itself is kind of liminal. It's ever changing, flowing. It's very kind of amorphous, ephemeral. Yeah. And so to start to put just some language around that, of course, acknowledging maybe the unfoundable nature of it. But I suppose what role does holding space as you see it being, what role does that play in this time?
Yes, I think the more complex, uncertain, and wobbly our lives become, the more we need containers to support our discomfort, our wobbliness, our impermanence, etc. And so when life is going along quite smoothly and we think we have some measure of control over our lives and we can, we can plan things, we can direct things, etc. Well, then we overlook our need for those kinds of relational kinds of ways of supporting each other. But once we are thrust into disruption and overwhelm and discomfort, that's when we need to learn new relational practices, both for ourselves, how to be in relationship with ourselves and how to be in relationship with each other. And I think that's what's really being drawn out with this concept of holding space. And I have had some profound conversations. I have a friend named Two Bears who is an Indigenous elder in the United States, and she talks about how a concept like holding space has always been available to us under the surface of our awareness and our wisdom. But when the world needs it, it will begin to emerge, and it will begin to emerge simultaneously in different parts of the world we'll bring it back into being and back into our wisdom and consciousness. And so I think that's where we're at right now, is this real deep need for it in the world to understand how to be present really for discomfort, for grief, for fear. And so holding space, to be honest, my definition of it keeps evolving. And though I have a book published now, and I feel like there should be some permanence when you have a published book, but it still continues to evolve for me in my consciousness. But really it's a willingness to walk alongside, to be present for another person's or our own discomfort, transformation, liminal space, without trying to control or direct or judge the process or layer our own stories onto it, to simply be willing to be present and in support of, and with our egos as much out of the way as possible, so that there is possibility for emergence and transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love that. And I love the piece that it's always there under the surface. And for me, that kind of speaks to this work about fundamentally being a kind of remembrance that it's not, and I mean, that's part of another question as well, is how do we teach holding space? And obviously you've now created a beautiful program, so I'm curious to dive into that. But the acknowledgement as well that in many ways, it's also in our nature, the idea of being with deeply. And so there's a real humility for me that comes through in acknowledging that kind of remembrance as part of the work.
Yeah, and it's a very good question, because I had to really wrestle with it when it first landed for me. And it's now 6 years ago in March when I had a blog post that went viral about holding space, and it's been seen by millions upon millions of people, over 10 million anyways. I lost count. But when it landed, and it was such a significant thing in my life, and people started turning to me for, wanting me to offer them some teaching, etc. It was very humbling and very overwhelming at first, because I thought, wait a sec, this is not a wisdom that I can own or lay claim to even expertise necessarily, because it is something that all of us have to tune into in ourselves and draw out of ourselves and learn to practice it. And so I had to really wrestle with, what does it mean to become a steward of this wisdom that wants to be born in the world, and not so much the expert of it, but to steward it and midwife it in a sense and allow it to be. And so I've really tried to hold it somewhat outside of myself as its own thing, its own wisdom, and with a real awareness that people around the world are showing up to do that with me, alongside me. And so I have, relationships with people in countries all over the world that are really people who are rising up to have that same awareness in themselves, that this is something we need to steward and work on. So it was with that humility, or effort at humility, that I did launch a program to help people learn it, and have brought people in to help me train other people. And just to understand the quality of it. But at the same time, knowing full well that the initial foundation program is an 8-month program, it's pretty cognitive, like it's in our head stuff. And until you go out there and practice it, it's only that. And so really encouraging people, okay, you've got to go out there and put this into practice and really show up for it as a practice and not just assume that because you completed this course, you know what it is. So, and when I teach, I really encourage people to even develop their own definition for it so that they have a relationship with it and don't just rely on me as the definer of what it is.
Yeah, I really admire the humility, the humus that you bring to your work, and the piece around allowing the program itself to be mysterious, to kind of savor that quality of the undefinable. And I was listening to a podcast that you just this morning on my walk, just to familiarize myself with your tone and rhythm. And it was speaking about protecting the mystery in a way, or not defining it, coming to a kind of dogma, or you being too much of a truth teller. And that having that be such a core part of your work in how you sit with the questions of how do we empower people to hold space, and also not defining those 8 steps or the whatever we come up with, and allowing them to really come to it within themselves as this living inquiry, almost a question that they too really ride in their lives.
Well, there's this great danger that I think has been perpetuated by a social media culture, that we look for the 10 easy steps for things and we ignore the complexity because we want some social media influencer to tell us how to live. And we disempower ourselves really by doing that, by looking to somebody else who can give us those 10 tips or 10 easy steps. And so I'm really pushing back against that and trying to call people to their own inquiry, call people to their own greatness and wisdom and relationship with this work. And it's hard. It's a bit countercultural sometimes to do that, but that feels like the way to be in integrity with the work.
Yeah, I'm curious about, as someone who also tries to toe that line between being what Priya Parker in her book The Art of Gathering calls the generous authority in a room, which I also relate to this kind of discernment between being humble and generous and gracious as a leader, and also cutting through in this market that does require, a kind of 7-word hook at the beginning of your post or whatever it is, and towing that line. And also the acknowledgement that maybe my humility will just attract those who are already partway through their process and those who I'm meant to work with, but also the sadness in, well, I'm just going to create a bubble and not reach the people that, are really needing the work. So how do you kind of sense that just in your own way?
It's a really good question. And I don't know fully the answer because I really am more and more aware of the levels of complexity of this work and the levels of readiness there needs to be for this work. And that's something I don't know that I saw right at the beginning, because I thought, well, I'll just put out some teachings, etc., and the right people will show up. And then some of the people that showed up weren't really the right people or weren't really ready. And I don't want to say they weren't the right people, but there is sometimes people that are not self-reflective enough to recognize I'm not quite ready for that level of work, or they misjudged it or miscalculated, or perhaps it was miscommunicated. But there does need to be some really intentional self-reflection and self-awareness to be able to hold depth and capacity and complexity. And to some degree, I cannot be the judge and jury of that. A person needs to be in their own self-reflection to see that in themselves and wrestle with that in themselves.
Yeah, it is so much a personal sensitivity and discernment.
Yeah.
Which is why I love questions. And I know you love questions as well. I remember, I think it was 4 years ago when I just finished putting together a set of journaling questions to send to my community, and then came across your work and then saw that you also had a journaling course. And just saw it was just another parallel that made me light up even more.
Yeah.
And it makes sense that facilitators love questions and the power of questions to open up these often hidden like alleyways within our psyche and soul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of questions. I'm working on a new release of deck of cards called 50 Questions That Could Change Your Life. And it evolved. I started it's almost 5 years ago, because it was on my 50th birthday that I put out 50 of my favorite questions, and and that might be what you're referring to. And it was that practice of, ask yourself a good question every day and sit with it and wrestle with it. You don't need to have an answer. Sometimes it's just the being present for the question and letting that question change you and evolve in you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious about to dive more into holding space as, I suppose, a philosophy of being is kind of how I see it. And also an art. There is a kind of art to it, which, I suppose I just want to note for those listening in as well. It doesn't need to be in the context of holding space for group work or for leadership retreats. It can be, and it is very much in one-on-one and totally with yourself. And so just for those listening to really listen to and apply whatever really touches you and moves you in some way in whatever context you find yourself in. But the idea I love you share around being the bowl, not the mould, and that as a kind of maybe a meta frame for what it means to hold space. And wondering if you could share a little more about that.
Sure. So that evolved really early on for me, and just to root this back in narrative, the blog post that I wrote that went viral was really about sitting with my mom as she was dying and having a palliative care nurse who was present for us, really holding space for my siblings and my mom and I in that process. And so that's where this work emerged, even though for me, I was a trained facilitator and coach. And so the holding space term came from facilitation. I really rooted it in a personal practice in a really relational space of a deathbed. And so that's how I view it, as a really complex concept that can show up in any relational space, whether that is one-on-one or it's in a group process, a really complex kind of community work, etc. It can show up in all those places. But what really felt like a common link in all of those is this concept of being a bowl. And that concept has evolved quite a bit too. In my really early work, I just saw the bowl and defined it as one layer, as a single layer of what you're doing when you're holding space. And then it continued to evolve for me, because I really saw, and the first time I used the bowl idea, I was speaking at a conference in Kentucky about 5 years ago, and they asked me, I did a keynote speech, and I was talking about the liminal space and the container that is needed for essentially the chrysalis, the bottom of I use kind of a U shape, a little bit based on theory U. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the bowl really was the container for when things are messy and fall apart, whether you're in that, the cocoon stage. It's essentially like the cocoon holding the mess of the chrysalis. And I also talked about Lego. It was one of my other metaphors, that if you used to be a Lego house, and you know that it's time to no longer be a house because now you're feeling constricted by that definition of yourself and you need to evolve. And perhaps you'll eventually evolve into a bridge, but a Lego house can't become a bridge unless it deconstructs. And when Lego deconstructs, as we know, if we've had Lego around the house, it can be really harmful and dangerous. People step on it and cut their feet and etc. So you need a container. You need containment for that messiness in the middle. And so that's where this concept started to evolve, this bowl. And I now have developed it into a 3-layer bowl. There's the inner layer, and that's really what we offer other people. It's compassion, it's empathy, selective non-judgment and selective guidance. There's another thing that's evolved as some of my language. I've included selective so that it's not quite as definitive in black and white. And then there's the middle layer of the bowl. And middle layer is really our inner guidance system, our intuition, our discernment, our curiosity. And then there's the outer layer, and that felt really important to evolve too. And you mentioned that term mystery, and the outer layer is really two things. It's mystery and community. That's what we lean into so that we can offer that inner layer. And so it's this dynamic, kind of complex container that has both support and offering and an internal strength that weaves it together.
Yeah, I love that. It feels, very integral. And I know integral theory is a big part of your philosophy as well. And to acknowledge the support that we as facilitators, and we all are, gain or are open to feeling from the mystery and from maybe a more transpersonal realm.
Yeah.
The ability to, I kind of see it, and I'm curious your feeling thoughts on this, but to hold the liminal is ultimately has a lot to do with how much of the mystery, the unknown within us and through us, we have the ability to hold. And so to be able to do that work requires a kind of relationship with the mystery itself.
Yes.
And a kind of grace or comfort in that.
Yeah.
And so I love that kind of the outer layer is that kind of relationship, which might help cultivate that inner grit, that inner self, which then can come as an offering.
Yeah. So what I realized early on is that anytime I go into ego and think I'm doing the work and I'm controlling, I'm the one holding space and only get into that I place, that's when I tend to hijack instead of hold space. And we can talk about that a bit more if you want. Hijack is the term I use for the opposite of holding space. But so what really felt important to me was that there had to be a recognition of external support and a container that I'm leaning into that is not ego-based. And I use the term mystery because I don't want to define it for anyone. I want people to be able to evolve their own definition for what is supporting them spiritually and in the physical world, energetically, and so I encourage people to find their sense of mystery, whether it is, I've got a great big tree in my backyard, and I feel like that tree holds space for me. Like when I really am, feeling like I'm kind of falling apart, I go and sit under the tree, and that's mystery for me. That's leaning into something that I can't quite define, but that I know is supporting the process.
Beautiful. Yeah, and it really can be anything. And I was going to ask, earlier when you were speaking about, or when we were touching on this notion of remembrance, for me, the lessons gleaned from a mentor of mine calls nature the original elder in many ways. The original teacher, maybe the original space holder. And I was going to kind of call on or inquire about how your relationship to place and nature and our broader ecologies influences your relationship to holding space. And it sounds like it very much holds you.
Yes. Yeah, I'll share a story with you. And this actually happened in Australia. It's one of my favorite stories. I was facilitating a retreat in the Brisbane area. And it was one of those really complex retreats. There was just so many layers. It was a fairly large group, 27 people, I think, in attendance. And I was fairly new to working in Australia, so I wasn't sure if I knew the culture, if I was reading the signals right. And there was lots of layers of, I knew something, there was just a stuck energy in the group. And I just wasn't, cognitively, I was not able to figure it out. You wrestle as a facilitator, wrestle with it. And yet I knew it was there. It was like we couldn't access deeper layers because people were staying in this kind of stuck energetic place. And it started to emerge a little bit what some of the relational pieces were in the group. There was some, really shadow brought into the group from the outside. And then it kind of erupted. And this was like the Saturday night and the retreat was ending on Sunday. And it just sort of showed up in the room as this really messy, ugly, now what do we do? And conflict showed up. And I looked around the circle and everybody's kind of looking like terrified. What the heck is this that's here? Somebody kind of spoke it into the room, how uncomfortable they were, how they weren't, understanding other people, et cetera, et cetera. And it was one of those moments I had to just lean in and trust my intuition and trust that the container was being held by something bigger than me, because I could not personally, from an ego place, figure it out. And so I said to people late in the day, I said, you know what, we had an event planned for the evening, but I said, we're canceling that. And I'm just going to invite all of us into silence and self-reflection and go outside and find a tree, lean on it, go for a little walk, find some connection with nature, be in a rest mode and stop trying to process it all in your head. And I left the retreat center just in high anxiety of was this retreat going to completely fall apart? And I went to the house where I was staying, which is on the same property, but set apart from the retreat center. And I did some of the things that I do to try to soothe my own nervous system when I'm in that kind of anxiety. I had a long bath, and I sat with Georgia, who's the owner of the retreat center, and we wrestled with it a little bit and tried to process it. And as we're sitting there talking, it's getting increasingly darker and darker. And she's got this house where the doors open wide so that it's, the sliding doors. And while we're sitting there, two things happen. First, we hear this noise in the kitchen behind us, and she goes to check, and there's a giant frog on the window, like it's the size of a palm. And and frog is sign of transformation, for example. And so she took the frog out. And then another thing happened. I can't remember which was first, but as we're sitting there, a bat flies into the room. And again, the bat, this symbol of darkness and shadow. But then we went to sleep. We got up in the morning, and I went to use the washroom and looked outside, and there were thousands of white butterflies flying over the land. It was the most amazing scene. We were in the middle of a butterfly migration, and all day they were crossing the land, just thousands and thousands of white butterflies. And I walked from the house over to the retreat center to get started, not knowing how it would go. As soon as I walked into that retreat center and people were starting to gather for breakfast and stuff, I could tell the energy had shifted. And sure enough, we sat down in circle and people started to crack open. We had the most beautiful, deep sharing. People admitted what they had brought, the pain they had brought and projected onto other people in the circle. There was and people were crying. It turned out there were two sisters that were in conflict, and they'd brought their conflict into the circle. There was another woman who was leaving a messy marriage ending, and she'd brought that pain into the circle and was projecting it at the men in the circle. She was angry at men. So all of these layers of complexity were there. But the moment we leaned in and just let mystery hold us instead of our egos and our minds, it kind of unraveled, and something entirely different showed up. So that's kind of how I try to be in this work, is what do I need to lean into here to allow that transformation to happen that I can't control?
What a beautiful story. Yeah, as an anchor to remember the power of, the mystery, the unknown, and maybe the original elder, if we were to call them or her or him that. And I love the ability as a facilitator, which again, all of us, when something feels beyond maybe our egos, our self capacity, to invite leaning on something greater than ourselves. And that takes great courage and humility in my experience to call it. Actually, I have no fucking clue.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the mystery has a clue, but in prior experience, it tends to. So let's try that.
Yeah. It's a really risky move in that moment. And you think people are going to think I'm crazy. And, and there was one person that left the retreat because she didn't think I'd made the right choice and sent me a fairly strong email about it. But she missed the mystery, to be honest. She missed that opportunity to see transformation happen, which is disappointing.
Yeah. And I'd love to touch on the opposite of holding space. You speak about holding space as being liberating, and the opposite of that being hijacking.
Yeah.
And it sounds like in this experience, it was incredibly liberating. I wonder if you could speak a little more about the opposite.
Sure.
And how that kind of shows up, I suppose, in our patriarchal and tending towards post-patriarchal culture.
Yeah, it's fairly early on. People started. It was actually on a podcast interview when the blog post went viral and people started interviewing me. Somebody asked me, "So, what's the opposite of holding space? And she kind of floored me with the question. I hadn't thought of it yet at that point. So that's part of the reason I love doing podcast interviews, because it always helps me think of the next inquiry into this work. And so I really had to wrestle with it. What is the opposite of holding space? And the first term I started to play with, I used the term emotional colonization, because it felt like a colonizing kind of energy of trying to control and direct and exploit what's in the room instead of allowing and being open. I've evolved it, and the term I now use, because it feels a little more simple and a little bit more easy to relate to, is hijacking space as the opposite of holding space. And so hijacking, when you think about somebody hijacking a plane, they're taking over control over it and deciding the direction it's going to go and exploiting that plane for their own personal use, etc. And so hijacking, that's what we do when we try to control a situation. And so instead of being the bowl, we're putting a lid on the bowl, and now we're trying to mold that shape and restrict it and keep people, like, now people are not liberated because they're not free to leave that space or make their own decisions. They're in a controlled environment. And so that comes from when I use the term hijacking space, and it's partly why I evolved out of emotional colonization, because emotional colonization feels really intentionally controlling, whereas hijacking, it can happen very, very unintentionally, because sometimes we want the best for somebody else. So we try to help them make the decision, and we influence them in the direct, a direction we think is right for them. It might be as innocent as that, like I, as a mom, for example, often hijack my kids' space because I think I know better than them because I'm their mom. And so almost always, I think hijacking space comes from a place of our own unmet needs, and we project that onto the situation and then try to control it because we need it to turn out a certain way. And so it takes a lot of personal work and a lot of self-reflection and being willing to sit with your own failings and limitations and your own grief and fear, etc., to not want to control and not try to hijack the space. So and like you say, we live in a world that has a lot of hijacking built into it. The way we build our systems, patriarchal systems, white supremacy, colonization, all of those are very much hijacking systems where they're controlling certain people, especially, and exploiting them. And so we have this model that's taught us how to be in relationships, unfortunately, and it's not one that offers each other dignity and respect.
Yeah, and the piece around, I suppose, another piece of the puzzle of this system is the busyness piece and the kind of hastefulness and the rush and urgency and riding on productivity, and it just feels like this feedback loop where if a big part of being able to hold space and liberate is a self-reflective practice, is grief work and being with these parts of ourselves, that takes time, lots of time, lots of space. And it's so hard to muster up the courage to choose time and space in a world that has our worth pegged against the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. You've hit the nail on the head, because that we've overproduced, we've become overproductive as capitalism, whatever, has driven us to assume that if we're not producing, we don't have value. And yet to really be in liminal space, to really be self-reflective and spend time, wrestling with your own demons or whatever you want to call them, that takes time and space and a leaning into the discomfort of not knowing the answer. That's where we come back to those questions. Like, am I willing to actually just be in questions and not trying to, I used to, when I worked in a government and nonprofit, I used to have to write strategic plans every year and, put things in nice boxes and stuff. And that's the frame that we're kind of used to, is like, no, I got to plan and I got to organize and I got to direct. And can I be in a much more liberated space where I'm willing to be present in questions instead? And that does take a lot of time. And I think I just had a conversation earlier today about how when complexity shows up in the room, we have this tendency to want to oversimplify it by giving it the first definition we can find so that there's only one problem to solve. And if we solve that problem, we can go back to the way things were. It's that returning to comfort. But complexity is an invitation to actually go a little deeper with something. But it does take a lot of commitment and time to do that.
Yeah. And grit, almost like I'd love to get into some of the more, maybe personal and self-practice dimensions of holding space. And what are some of the things that I suppose you teach in the practitioner course, and how you've attempted to create a kind of a teaching for holding space, and what some of those things are that maybe we need reminding.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so how is it that or what are maybe some invitations that you might offer to people looking to deepen or remember in a more profound way what it means to hold space for self and others? Yeah, some of those threads of invitation.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting things when I developed the program. So first of all, when I first had that blog post go viral, very quickly I was getting all these emails and my inbox exploded with people sharing all these stories of how this blog post resonated. And I had this really strong awareness that these were people holding space in complex spaces, in prisons and conflict zones and, hospice care, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, wait a second, who's telling these people that they need to hold space for themselves? Like I just sort of was like, I just saw this burnout happening and people over-sacrificing themselves and over-giving because that was what they felt they were meant to do. And so I took a step back and I wrote a follow-up blog post. And I said, wait a second, make sure you're holding space for yourself first. And ironically, it was actually in a time of my life, pretty well all of my work comes out of my own lived experience. And it was in a time of my life when I kind of hit burnout myself because I wasn't holding space for myself or having it held for myself very effectively at that time. My marriage was in the process of ending, and I had to really take a step back and I had to practice what I was trying to preach in terms of how to hold space for myself. And then when I developed, a year or so later, I started developing this program. At first, like there's 5 modules, and the second module is on holding space for yourself. And it was only a 4-week module. And every time I taught it that way, it was like people would just go into these really deep places and say, wait a second, 4 weeks, I can't get there in 4 weeks. Like they would just get so overwhelmed and so confronted by that module that they had to learn how to hold space for themselves. So we actually ended up expanding that part. And that's why it's now an 8-month program, because that's really the juice of this work is I can't hold space for other until I can hold space for self. And so some of those things are how to be present for your own emotions, for example. And I teach some practices about really tapping in and listening and hearing your own emotions and tuning into yourself instead of shutting them down. Because some of that we've been trained and socially conditioned into shutting down. And speaking of socially conditioning, that's another one I really invite people to wrestle with. Like, what are your stories you're carrying with you from your childhood about how you're supposed to show up, how you're supposed to treat other people? And so it's leaning into your own emotional journey, your own, social conditioning, your own triggers. What are the things that send you into a tailspin? What are your own practices? How can you develop your own self-soothing practices? How can you be more intentional about developing relationships? Who's holding space for you? Who is your container so that you can, this language around co-regulation, for example, if you're out there doing this good work, who are you going home to at the end of the day? Or, who are you talking to later in the day who's going to help you process this so that you can show up the next day to do it? So those are all parts of how we have to learn practices for ourselves so that we can then turn around and hold space for others.
Yeah, and it's just what's coming up for me is this relationship to the mystery. And if holding space, if a large part of that is having a relationship to the mystery, I suppose the notion of spiritual bypass and the Ken Wilber's pre-post trans fallacy, that in many ways we have to become a person to think and forget about our person. Or we have to become someone to become more than someone. And so the personal, then post-personal, kind of, it's not that linear, but that model.
Yeah.
And that if holding space is in many ways a relationship to the mystery and being able to be from then through that place, then it requires a personalization. Like we have to become ourselves before we just try and hold space from that place. Otherwise, we
Yes.
bring in shadow, we bring in bias. And so it sounds like, yeah, for you, just recognizing a large part is actually to become someone and recognize all of the facets of who that someone is on the way to then becoming maybe no one or everyone.
Yeah. 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 And I think it's really important to recognize, and this is, some of integral or spiral dynamics. I don't know if you know that work as well, but recognizing the multi-layered journey that this is to becoming known to ourselves, that there is going to always be another layer that you're going to have to go into and deepen. And I speak from personal experience. I've spent the last month kind of really wrestling with a whole new layer of things I was confronted with and had to see in myself. And no matter how long I'm in this work, there's always going to be another layer for me to uncover and be present with. And so it's a recognition of that kind of journey to self, lifelong journey to self, and lifelong journey to healing what we need to heal, to growing into what we need to be present for, to evolving that relationship with mystery and community in a deeper and deeper way. And yeah, so I really invite people to have a lot of patience with themselves and self-love, like really be present for yourself in a way, in a radical way that allows you to nurture what wants to grow in you.
Yeah. Yeah. Patience and slowness.
Yes.
And just recognizing how radical it is for both of those things in our culture. And so, just really surrounding ourselves, I suppose, with people where that is totally okay and celebrated to be just slow and have a bath and listen to Beethoven or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm almost here in the Northern Hemisphere. It's springtime and I've got about 7 more weeks of work. And then I'm taking a sabbatical over the summer where I'm going to be really intentional about just being in that place of slowness, like sitting under my tree in my backyard and not trying to produce anything because it's absolutely necessary. And I remember M. Scott Peck, I don't know if you know his work, A Different Drum, and he writes a lot about community. He's a psychologist, and he wrote, I remember somebody asking him once how he accomplished so much, because he's got several books published, has done a lot of work. And his answer was, I have to spend an hour and a half every day doing nothing. And so twice a day, he would block off 45 minutes to just stare out the window or whatever it was, his putter in his garden. But he had to guard those times. He would put it, and everybody in his world knew that there's these 2 45-minute blocks where he's not available to anyone. And he might be sitting there staring out the window or something, but he's being really intentional about guarding that empty space. And I think that's really important for all of us, to just guard those empty spaces for ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I'm just breathing that in as permission. Yeah. Yeah. And it kind of brings up what we were talking about before in the patience and slowness, and recognizing that this is a lifelong inquiry.
Yeah.
Brings up for me the notion of paradox, which I always, I suppose, love to insert in any conversation around holding space and the mystery, and the notion that we are always whole and we're always partial. And so how do we recognize at one and the same time that I am whole and actually I'm complete as I am? And of course, yes, there's further ways I can come to know myself from the inside out and to be with all that I am. And the ability to have a relationship to those paradoxical, I suppose, realities of being human in a world as being quite fundamental to space holding. And so I just wonder if you could speak to, I suppose, for you, the relationship between being with or straddling paradox and holding space.
Yeah. And I think when I hear you say, being whole and incomplete at the same time, I think that there's a lot that we can gain from being in relationship with the natural world in that regard, because the natural world really teaches us how to be present. And I think for example, when you pay attention to the seasons and what needs to die in one season so that something can grow in the next, and when does the seed need to lay dormant under the soil in order for it to be prepared for springtime when there's growth. And I think that we all need to lean into that a little bit more about what in me needs to die right now, what do I need to release, and then when is it the season for just stillness and rest and withdrawing, and then when is the season for explosive growth and being present for the greenness of spring. And so I really try to be present for those kinds of things and recognizing we are not machines, and we're not meant to be machines. We are very organic beings in an organic world, trying to be present in ways that don't kill us, that don't destroy us. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Again, just the word humility is coming up. Just resting in our inherent mess and mystery.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounded like before the self-reflective practice and the kind of the develop of a meta-cognition as being super important in the ability to hold space, to be able to, as I often talk about, to kind of hold your own mind in mind and someone else's mind in mind. And mind, of course, being not just cognition, but an embodied relational phenomena. And so self-reflective practice as absolutely crucial in developing that kind of meta stance, to be able to be kind of witnessed and really embodied at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I would expand that to say self-reflective and collectively reflective as well. So I could not do this work without a journal personally. Like, I need to be able to spill things onto a page, unedited and very reflective and messy. And so that's one of my self-reflection practices, is to just go to the page and spill and process as I'm spilling. And then in relational spaces, collectively reflective. I think a conversation like this, for example, is a collective reflection space where, you've asked me really good questions that help me process what's another deeper level, what's another question I want to be present with in my own inquiry. And so that both and the self and other, self and relational, I think really always needs to be interplay.
Yeah. And it's been a big part of my reflection. And I have seen it more and more pop up in the kind of wellness space. And I think I saw you did an article maybe last month on community care and this notion of self-improvement and self-help and self-care, and very much forgetting or leaving aside the relational, social dependency on and within community.
Yeah.
And that, I suppose it just feeds into this kind of false binary that self and community are actually separate, and that you need to separate from community in order to look after self.
Yeah.
And so, I suppose just acknowledging that. And I wonder if you have any other nuanced thoughts that have composted since you did that post around reframing community care and tending to that kind of false binary.
Yeah, it's really one of my soapbox things, is that I get frustrated with the fact that my book, that's just come out, The Art of Holding Space, has no place to land in a bookstore, because there's a self-help section and then there's a relationship section in some bookstores, but it's only really about marriage or something, that there's no space. And I keep wrestling with that and wanting to expand that space. I want more people to write books that are relational and expansive in terms of what's our community care, what's our duty to each other in relationship, and how do we evolve that. And I think you mentioned Priya Parker, The Art of Gathering, for example. There are other books out there, but it seems to be still a fledgling space for writers and thinkers to get books published in it. So I want that space to continue to grow and expand, and I want us to wrestle with what is the interplay, because I can't, and I said I've gone through this last month of really lots of kind of dark night of the soul stuff, where I really had to go internal and, spent some really painful nights awake and wrestling with some things. And I very much aware that if I had not had people holding containers for me, that it would have been really destructive to myself to go through that without the care and love. And that means some real humility of letting people love you, letting people show up with unconditional positive regard who will witness you and not let you stay stuck. They'll hold you accountable. Some of the people had to say some hard truths into my life. And so that's absolutely critical in terms of our evolution. We can never fully see the lettuce between our teeth unless we have a mirror, and we can't see ourselves unless we are in relationship and people mirror things back to us. So I think we need to be always on the lookout for those people that will do deep work with us, who we can really trust and entrust our vulnerability to. And it can be a really small circle. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's hard to find those people, but the more intentional we are, the better we are at showing up with each other in those spaces.
Yeah. And I suppose a great exercise or invitation for those listening in is maybe doing a kind of interpersonal inventory or circle of trust. And maybe I'll link to an example in the show notes, but to identify who those core people are, where you do feel super held and intimate and trusted with, and you can go on this journey with them as well. And I suppose for me, that's something I found in terms of developing the capacity to hold space. For me, that's the training ground, is those intimate relationships. Mm-hmm. And if I can feel safe enough and my courage is protected enough to have these conversations, to have these, somewhat tense and very uncomfortable dialogues that are very personal, and really touch on my root of belonging and identity, but in a very safe way, then that builds my kind of grit to then be able to do that with more people.
Yeah, exactly. Because then you have to be able to know that if you fall apart, somebody can hold you. Somebody has capacity to hold you. Mm-hmm. And the deeper the work we do, the more risk there is of falling apart. It's just inevitable that the deeper and deeper I take this work, the more complex spaces I'm in, the more my ego is going to fight its way to the surface, the more I'm going to mess up and get triggered and etc. And so the more robust I need my containers to be to support me in that.
Mm-hmm. And so, I suppose it's an invitation to those listening in, just to maybe do a little bit, not an audit. That sounds a little bit too, serious, but a reflection, an honest, candid reflection on who are those people for you.
Yeah.
And I suppose just also noting that it can be confronting when asking those questions.
Yeah.
And so, to be gentle with oneself as well when reflecting on that topic. As we come to close, and there was so much more I wanted to dive into, but I'm curious on two things, I suppose. One is further resources for those looking to deepen in the art of holding space. And of course, there's your beautiful book, there's The Scent of Holding Space, which will be all in the show notes. I'm wondering any of the kind of teachers that you go to, the people that you really respect, their writing and their way of mentalizing this topic. Who is it that you would recommend?
Yeah, well, some of the recent reads that have really been deeply resonant for me, I would say fairly recently I read a book called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. I highly recommend that as a read because it really helps us wrestle with our own unwillingness to look our own mistakes in the eye. And the names of the authors, it's two authors and they escape me right at the moment. One of them, the last names is Eliot, but if you look for Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me is one of the books. And then another book that I've read really recently that was quite profound for me is a book called Burnout. And it's about how to complete the stress cycle. And I think that was really profound because it helped me see how much culturally it's geared particularly to women, because it's really looking at how patriarchy is burning us out with this perfectionism and this need to show up a certain way. And so there's a real learning there for me in terms of how do I need to continue to deepen my own self-protection and my boundaries around how I won't burn myself out and I won't overperform. I need to rest and be present for myself. And so those are just a couple of recent reads that I pass on to your listeners.
Lovely. Thank you. I hadn't heard of the first one. Definitely heard of the second one. Listened to, I forget their names, but two sisters, the authors, the episode with Brene Brown.
Right. Emily and Amelia Nagoski, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love the link between kind of stress as microtrauma. And so the similar kind of neurophysiology plays out with stress. And we have to complete the cycle. Yeah. So I'll definitely put those links in the show notes. And then, I'm wondering what is on the edge of your curiosity or your confusion at the moment in this inquiry of holding space and, reweaving a culture that protects our courage, and what is kind of on the edge of your inquiry?
Yeah. Well, I'm just very close to launching a new self-study program on holding space in times of disruption and overwhelm. And so that's going to be available sometime in the next few weeks. So I've been really, in this time of pandemic, trying to be present for how do we, on our own and collectively, hold space for really significant disruption in the world, because I think we're going to see more and more of it in the coming years with climate change, et cetera. So really, how do we build our muscles in this work so that we can be present for the really, really difficult times in our life? And then I'm really wrestling with, and one of the conversations I had today was about how we're having to learn new relational skills in online spaces that we haven't evolved for yet entirely. And when you talk about completing the stress cycle, for example, we talked a little bit about co-regulation, for example, and do we know how to co-regulate with people when we're not able to touch, we're not able to even look each other right in the eye, like even on Zoom, we're looking slightly off away from each other's eyes because the way the screens are set up, and what needs to evolve in us because this is a reality of our lives, especially now and will continue to be. How do we deepen our practices so they're not just surface? And, and this is a bit of a reaction to what's on social media. It becomes kind of a shallow space. And how do we use the tools available to us, but really deepen our practices in those spaces that make them meaningful and lend them depth and make them really relational and not just transactional, not performative. That's really on the edge of my inquiry right now.
Yeah, thanks for letting me and us in. I love the co-regulation in an online space. How do we? And what kind of social relational technologies do we need to either develop or just practice more deeply and intentionally?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for just admire how deeply in the inquiry you are and listening to the needs of the collective to really sense this edge between self-care and disruption. And it's one thing that I do admire and that I'm definitely taking away as a note for me is just I suppose a real deep listening and sensing with the collective and allowing the inquiry to be with the collective a little more.
Yeah.
So thank you for really offering and reflecting that.
Oh, I was just going to say you're very welcome. It's really been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed your depth of inquiry into this work as well.
Thank you. And there's many, many more tourist routes we could have taken, I'm sure. I'm wondering if you have any parting invitations or notes for listeners.
Yeah, I think just right now, I don't know how it is in your part of the world, but I've had a lot of conversations in the last month where there's, I think, a year plus into this pandemic, we're just in a really frayed emotional place. And I'm hearing about just major relationship disruptions and some really deep pain from being disconnected from each other for so long. And so I really want to encourage people to give themselves a lot of self-love and patience. And we don't know how to do this. Even a year in, we don't really know how to be present in this really disruptive space. And so go easy on yourself and give yourself kindness in this. And we are relearning relational patterns and need to give ourselves grace.
Yeah. Echoing that, and may we all hear that deeply, feel that deeply, and support each other in, I suppose, in acknowledging this as a time for self-care, and also community care. And part of that is supporting each other's self-care. And so may we all create that culture too. Thank you so much, Heather.
You're very welcome.
For your work, for your love, your guidance, your space. And I look forward to having you in Melbourne sometime soon, hopefully.
Yes, let's make that happen.
What questions are still whirring inside for you? What landed and what rung loudly for you? Let's just take a moment. Thank you for joining me for another life-affirming, enriching conversation, each one a light, a torch to guide us on our path to being in right relationship with ourselves, those we walk with, and the ecologies we are very much a part of. I trust this has gifted you something to place in your toolkit to support you in your own journey and your leadership. Sitting here and practicing and recording on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation here in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, I'd like to pay my deep respects and thanks to their elders past, present, and emerging. And may this work, this offering, be a prayer for the remembrance, the renewal, and the reclamation needed to live in relationship with culture and country, as those who have been here for tens of thousands of years have done so powerfully. Also to acknowledge Brother Keenan from Roan, whose beautiful music we are graced by in the intros and outros for the show. So thank you to Brother Keenan, and do check him out. Such sweet, reminding tones. And links to his platforms in the show notes. And do make sure to connect with me and leave any comments on my Facebook or Instagram page @aljeffrey_. And check out the links in the show notes. This show is completely funded by listeners just like you. So if you feel generous and wish to be part of nourishing these inquiries we're exploring, you can leave a once-off donation or soon subscribe to my community membership. All the show notes, resources, and donations are all at spacesbetweenpodcast.com. Until next time, beautiful one, we can't rush our way back. Notice the connections and tend to the sweet spaces between. Lots of love.